Did you know the Epic of Gilgamesh is actually inspired by 5 earlier Sumerian poems? So in part 1 of this we translated a line from one of the 5 poems which inspired the Epic of Gilgamesh, called The Death of Gilgamesh. Today we're going to be translating a line from another one of those 5 poems known as Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld. So in this poem our hero Gilgamesh is essentially playing a game that involves a stick and a ball, and he drops that stick and the ball into the Netherworld. And then Enkidu, which in this poem is actually his servant, offers to go down to the Netherworld and retrieve the items for him. So Gilgamesh gives Enkidu some tips to survive the underworld essentially, as it is known as the land of no return. No mortal man will return from the Netherworld if he manages to get in. So Gilgamesh says you need to kind of dress a certain way, you need to act a certain way if you are going to return. Enkidu doesn't listen and, of course, is trapped in the Netherworld. Which brings us to today's translation. In Sumerian it reads, Enkidu ede igi, kurre imandab. So starting us off we have Enkidu's name here, and then here we have the verb ede, which is a form of the verb ed, which means to descend or ascend. In this context we know it to be descend. And then we have igi, so gi is the verb which means to return, and e3 is a conjugation prefix. So the conjugation prefixes can get a little bit complicated, and E3 is no exception to the rule. So essentially we're going to make it as simple as possible for the understanding of this sentence. So as it says here, the function of e or e may be defined here as an element moving the verbal base out of its lexical mode into a finite verbal mode. So gi meaning to return, it would take on the meaning in this context, he returned it, or he returned them, because it's referring to the stick and the ball. Then we have Korre. So kor, you'll know from previous videos, can take on multiple meanings, but here it is meaning the Netherworld. And then we have re, so the R is being carried over from kor, which is known as the auslaut, and the E, normally in this situation you would think, oh, it's probably the ergative case marker because the verb at the end is transitive. However, I think it's actually the directive case here. So the directive case is essentially a non-human form of the dative. So the dative, which means to or for in Sumerian, that is normally marked ra, and it is attached to human cases. So for example, lugal means king, so if you had lugal ra, that would mean to or for the king. So the non-human class version of that would be e, so this could mean to the Netherworld. And then we have imma, so we'll know from previous videos that this is the form of the ventive, mu, and then this here is actually taking on the middle marker, which is known as ba. Again, can get super complicated, so for simplicity, the middle voice can indicate that the action or state affects the subject of the verb or his interest. Then we have n, which is the third person singular animate subject marker of the verb being dab5, which means to take or to seize. So if we are to translate this a little bit more literally, so we will have Enkidu descends, he returned them. To the Netherworld, he was taken, or he was seized. And here is the full translation on the electronic corpus of Sumerian literature. Enkidu went down to retrieve them, but the Netherworld had seized him. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next video.